additional incremental good news today. We're very pleased about that. We've whittled down the amount of money that we owe our K-12 school system to just a little bit over $800 million now, a debt that we need to remember we still owe them. But I think what you need to remind yourself of is Minnesota's economy hit bottom in GDP in June of 2009. So we are over 3.5 years into this economic recovery, and it's very incremental. So it seems like the governor's message of continuing down the path, if we're going to continue down the path and provide for the things that I think most Minnesotans think are important, the investments that are important, we're going to continue down the road of doing significant tax reform to try and improve the stability of Minnesota's economy. I didn't ask Dr. Stinson today when the next recession is going to hit, but we all know they happen. And we need to position Minnesota in a better place structurally for the next time we hit that next economic downturn. And we intend in the Senate to continue to pursue that. So looking forward to your questions.
Well, as Tom said, this is a good day for Minnesota and for Minnesotans. The forecast clearly shows improvements in our budget situation, but it is important to remember we still have a nearly $700 million budget deficit we have to repay, and a school shift that we are committed to repaying. We need to get our budget square before we move forward. This is also a real opportunity, though, I think, for the state of Minnesota, and we need to look at it that way. We really have an opportunity, even better now, to get out of the cycle of continued budget deficits that we've suffered through for the last 10 years, and really just restore some structural stability to our state budget. But more importantly than that, this is really an opportunity for us to look forward for the first time in a long time. There are investments we need to make. We don't need to just deal with the problem immediately in front of our noses right now. We can look 5 and 10 years out and start making the kind of investments that we need to make in the state of Minnesota to position ourselves. Investments in education, first and foremost. Representative Marquardt's goal of creating the best workforce in the world by 2025. We have a chance to move in that direction and to kind of free ourselves from this situation where we're just constantly struggling with the problem that's right in front of us, but look to the future. A chance to invest in the middle class through property tax relief, things that we've been talking about for quite a long time. And again, a chance to finally get a budget that truly is square, that doesn't rely on budget gimmicks and accounting shifts. There's going to be differences as we move forward, but the good thing right now, and the thing I think that is the most hopeful for us, is that we all share those same values. Investments in education, investments in property tax relief, investments in job creation. We're committed to continuing to move on those. I think Minnesotans agree with us that that's the place that we need to be, and that's the kind of long-term view that we need to take. And we look forward to moving on that, understanding that we still have a significant problem left to solve before we can get there. Thanks.
I'll just add that, as you know, legislators have been putting in long hours at the Capitol as we approach our first policy deadline. But I think obviously today's news is good news for those of us who are working up here and for all of Minnesotans, all of Minnesota. The state has been on a roller coaster of nearly constant deficits for over a decade. And as we put the economic downturn behind us, hopefully, and look to the future, we're focused on leaving a better Minnesota for our kids and grandkids. So my message is just that it's a good day, brings a little sunshine to the dreary weather we've been having this week. And although there are certainly difficult decisions that remain to be made this legislative session, I think that we're on the right track and hopeful for the future.
As we've approached today, I've reminded members that with the forecast, our work will intensify, and you can feel it already. And especially for our first termers, they have given me a lot of looks of doubt because they know that we've been working hard. And I will tell you that I think we are a very productive legislature already. Before today, we've already sent to the governor some significant bills for his signature: tax conformity, the expansion of medical assistance, and the state employee contract. But with the forecast today, our most essential work, the budget, will ramp up, and we know the economy is recovering. It's recovering slowly but surely. And while the forecast reveals another deficit, it is improving for us, and it's improving for Minnesota families. It's time for us to balance the budget honestly, to bring stability, and to end our deficit-to-deficit mentality of the past decade, which has not served Minnesota well at all. Middle-class families have felt burned by the deep cuts, by property tax increases, by tuition increases, and I think they're tired, just like we are, of the deficit-to-deficit budget balancing that's occurred in this building for more than a decade. I think Minnesotans are with us when they ask us to think about our future. We share priorities with them around education. And I think it's really time for us to lead again in Minnesota. It's time for us to lead for a better future for Minnesota. Minnesotans value their schools, and they want their kids to get the best education in the world, and so do we. But Minnesota has slipped in education from 10th to 22nd in our funding, and we have an achievement gap that is an embarrassment really for us, and it should trip us into action. So instead, let's make Minnesota the pinnacle again when it comes to a world-class education. We've gone from deficit to deficit, from budget to budget, from gimmick to gimmick. And it's time now for us to look ahead to the future. We face tremendous challenges when we think of demographics, when we think about the future, where people live and how they live, and we need to address those things. And it's time to finally invest in our future. And this good day helps us do that. We're working ahead, looking at solutions and leaving the status quo behind.
Doesn't the reduction in the projected shortfall reduce the need for the large tax increases that the governor's proposed?
Well, I think I heard the governor say that he wanted to reinvest at least some part of that money in the tax bill. And I kind of did the math in my head. As the two issues he talked about was the renter's credit. I think to go back to previous law prior to 2011 is probably going to cost about a little north of $50 million. And you heard him with the number on the capital equipment refunds, 125 or so. So you're starting to approach 200 million of the savings in the forecast. And so if those are his priorities, there really isn't, it takes up about half of what was left. But I do still think strongly that we have to go through this exercise of tax reform to position Minnesota better in the future. And I strongly support having that conversation. Frankly, I don't think this even slows that down. And I do want to say on the Representative Thiessen and I now, today sets the table for us to start discussing with our finance and tax chairs what our budget targets are going to be. And we talked this morning about making them public for you and for all of our respective finance and tax members before the Easter recess.
Mr. Leader, and maybe I'm deluded, and if so, please correct me. You are the first time. But my impression is that you are a lot less enthusiastic than your House counterpart about moving down this path of what the governor's talking about, investments, new revenue, than the House leaders are. Is that correct or not?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I spent most of my time in the legislature living on the tax side of the equation, and so I think you'd probably expect me to, people when they get here, when they get elected, you kind of make a decision if you want to go off on the spending side or the tax side, and my personal place has been in the tax side, and they're distinctly different areas of work, but I expect that we're going to spend the level of money on K-12 and on economic development jobs that the governor did, maybe more, possibly made more by what we learned today.
How do you do that without broadening the sales tax?
I didn't say we're not going to broaden it. I said I support the idea of tax reform.
So, Senator, were you saying that you would want to increase spending maybe more than the governor has already proposed on education?
I think when I sit down with a conversation with Senator Cohen, based on today's numbers, he's probably going to make that request. And we have been, and you heard me say it some months ago, I am very concerned about this growing reliance on voter-approved levies to fund schools. It's creating huge disparity across our state. Now, for us to mitigate that and move away from voter-approved levies, we have to have cash to put in to our K-12 schools. That's where I consistently have been. I think that potentially is made a little better today. Now, whether you call that new spending on schools or you call that property tax relief, I think you can probably argue it either way. But that's something the governor did not have in his original budget proposal.
Mr. Speaker, could you talk about the necessity or desire to back off some of the tax increases? The sales taxes in particular haven't been wildly popular with your individual members.
No, we're still looking at all aspects of it. I mean, the bottom line is we really do want to, first of all, pay off the deficit, and we still have a significant chunk we have to take there. We want to pay off the school shift, and we're going to focus in on doing that. And then I really do think we need to make these new and additional investments in education and job development and property tax relief. And, so we're going to be looking, there's many different ways to kind of get to that spending level, and we're going to be looking at all numerous options. I will say that I imagine that an income tax and high earners will probably be part of that package, though.
But not sales taxes. He said
Beyond that, the income tax doesn't get you there. So.
Session, both of you were talking in terms of the importance and the difficulty of tamping down member expectations about the amount of new spending that could occur. Doesn't the good news in this forecast make that task even harder for you in the near term? Because it looks like more money now.
I would say that I think that's true. I think as people have gotten here and understood that that we still have a deficit, so it's improved by 400 million, a little around that, 350 million dollars. And the school shift has been paid off a bit, but we still have a big chunk that we have to deal with just to get back to zero. And I think members are understanding that, and more. And then just because the forecast improves shouldn't also mean that we are kind of releasing people to spend more money. As I look at how we make these investments, I think instead of just kind of fitting, and we said this from the beginning, instead of fitting it into a particular budget that we want to hit, what we need to do is figure out what investments we really need to make that are going to make a difference, and then balance that out. So it's not really just about filling a hole or filling a particular line on a budget sheet. It's about figuring out what is going to be best for Minnesota 5 and 10 years from now. And that's the process we've been going through, and that's the process we'll continue to go through. So I don't think this necessarily changes the amount of investments we need to make necessarily. It may create some more flexibility, but we're going to spend the money we think will make a difference to improve Minnesotans' lives.
Mr. Speaker, you're set to be followed by the minority who was in charge last time when the governor stood where you stood. He actually talked about the $2 billion in structural cuts that he and the majority at the time were involved in. They're going to crow like it's morning on their roosters. What are you going to say about the difference?
Well, what I would say, first of all, it is a good day in Minnesota. And I think what we need to be doing is looking forward, and that's what we're about. People can do what they want about the past. What I hear the minority saying, though, is they think that the status quo is satisfactory. That's what their argument is, and I don't think the status quo is satisfactory. We have had a decade where 90% of our budget has been balanced through shifts, gimmicks, and cuts, more than 90%. And as we look forward, we also know, as Representative Murphy alluded to, our education system is not keeping up with where we need to be to compete in a global economy and to make sure that middle-class families have the opportunities to succeed. So we are not about the status quo. We're about improving Minnesota and Minnesotans' lives, and that's what we're going to focus in on as we move forward.
When you talk about repaying the school shift, are you talking about the aid and the property tax side of things, or just one or the other, like all 800 million or something less than that?
We believe that we need to get our budget square before we move forward. So when we come back to a deficit that we face again, we're going to have the flexibility to deal with that. So I would like to pay off the whole school shift.
So your budget will include some sort of mechanism to pay off the entire.
We're still working that out, but that's my goal.
Bottom line it for me. I hear about more investment and more things you want to spend money on. I don't hear any of you say we now have 400 million more on the bottom line. We want to back away from some of the unpopular tax increases that the governor has proposed. Do I?
I think in response to Sean's question, I think I did answer that question, which is to say we're not looking at it from the perspective of now we have 400 million more to spend or 400 million to take off the table. We're looking at figuring out what exactly do we need to invest to make sure that Minnesota is well positioned. And that really doesn't necessarily have to match up with a particular number on a budget sheet or that this forecast would necessarily change that. We want to make a decision based on the facts and what will lead to the right outcomes for our state, and not just because we have another, money to spend or less money to spend.
Senator Bach, your opinion on that?
Well, kind of to the first part of your point, Sean, those $2 billion in cuts, much of that led to increased property taxes. Remember, they got rid of the market value homestead credit. They cut local government aid. They cut a number of things in the tax area. That's where most of the cuts were. So, and the shifts went onto the property tax burden. So that's been the troubling thing over the last decade, is the state has really abandoned our schools and abandoned our local governments and said, go fend for yourselves. Our higher education tuition's been skyrocketing, our property taxes have been skyrocketing, and I do hope that one of the outcomes of this session is two things, I guess. One is we get our fiscal house in order, and the second is that we restore a stronger relationship between the state and our local units of government and schools where the services are really delivered. I think that's critically important. And just cutting them and telling them, well, go raise property taxes, that's been the solution of the last decade. And I think you're going to see us change course and build a stronger relationship with higher education, with K-12, and with our local governments. And I don't know, and I guess, Rachel, to your point, if we lower the governor's tax plan, I think I heard him say there's some things he wanted to do, that still scored his spending. So, I mean, just because we all of a sudden do the capital front, the upfront exemption on capital equipment, that's still spending.
What's the time frame moving forward for getting the budget done?
So, as Senator Bach alluded to, we're going to get our targets out, before we go to Easter break. I imagine then we're aiming probably for the latter half of April to get budget bills off the floor, and then go to conference committee, and so that right, yeah, okay.
How do federal issues like the sequestration play into that process in the coming weeks?
Let's let Aaron answer that.
There may be an impact. Seriously. Yeah, go ahead.
I think what's really interesting on that subject is what you haven't heard about. There's been some talk about Minnesota's not greatly impacted because we don't have a lot of federal money returned to Minnesota per capita, like 49th in the country or something. So the impact on Minnesota is probably a lot less than other places. But what nobody has talked about is what are the other impacts. And I was actually over at the University of Minnesota earlier this week, met with President Kaler, and I asked him what effect is the sequestration going to have on the U? $50 million of research money that's now not going to come to the University of Minnesota. So there are impacts, I think, when you talk about job loss, that are about a lot more than just what impacts our state general fund relative to sequestration. There are other places, and significant, like the University of Minnesota, that are going to be impacted by it.
We're looking at a $1.3 billion debt capacity. What kind of size of a bonding bill are we looking at?
Well, we're still looking at that. From my perspective, from the House's perspective, record low interest rates, a great need to invest in infrastructure in this state. I mean, this is the time, we probably actually, if we make the investments this year, we probably have to actually make money in the sense, if inflation does start to pick up on that difference, we actually probably start to kind of, in a sense, make money on that because we're borrowing at such a low rate. So this is the time to make those investments, and there clearly are the needs out there to do that, including this building. So we're continuing to look at making we'd love to do a sizable bonding bill.
Pass the cigarette tax increase or not?
I don't know if it makes it harder to pass a cigarette tax increase or not. I mean, I think the theory on the cigarette tax, it's obviously revenue, which helps. But the main argument on the cigarette tax has always been much more about the public health impact of that. And I think that's how most of the advocates and most of the folks here in the legislature view that issue.
Just answer my question about bonding.
I do think there is some urgency in order to keep the renovations on the Capitol going. We're going to have to do some kind of a bonding bill. I would like to get back into the cycle of doing the regular bonding session like we historically have in the even-numbered year. I guess if the House sends us $1 billion-dollar bonding bill, the Senate will respond, but you need to remember those bills have to originate in the House. So the Senate can propose whatever we want to propose, but at the end of the day, unless they send us a vehicle to put bonding on, there's not going to be one, and I don't have a clue. It takes bipartisan support where the Republican caucus is at on that issue.
Do you expect to take it through the committee process at this point, or are you really just waiting for the House?
Well, all the bonding bills in the Senate were referred to the finance committees. That's so that those bills could get heard in the divisions that have jurisdiction over them. I actually have I think Senator Tomassoni's got a bonding hearing coming up on some natural resource type bonding issues or economic development ones coming up. I've actually encouraged Senator Cohen to have his finance committees hear the bills so that so that they can make some recommendations to Senator Stump and the bonding committee as to what he might want to consider. So I think you'll expect to hear bonding bills heard in the appropriate finance committees.
On that point, question for the majority leader. Do you actually think you can get the votes out of the House since it's been threatened based on your rule changes that you won't get any support from the Republican members?
You know, I think the people who made those threats have backed away from those threats. And I think the House of Representatives is going to be interested in trying to do what's best for Minnesota, and there are clearly infrastructure needs that could be eased with a bonding bill, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.